Hey Shore, welcome to the first week of hashtag LTD. We are so stoked for this series. I want to start off with a bang, so I'm going to show you guys a little magic trick. So here I have just a regular 5. Okay, nothing special about it. For this, I need a 1 for the sake of the credibility of the trick. Does everybody have a 1? David. Just any 1. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we have a 1 and a 5. So what I'm going to do with the 1 is I'm going to fold it lengthways, face in, okay, nothing special. And then what I'm going to do with the 5 is the same thing. I'm going to fold it lengthways, face out, and I'm going to fold the 5 again. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the 1 on the outside of the 5. Okay? The 1 is on the outside of the 5. Okay, I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Now the 1 is moved to the inside of the 5. Now what I'm going to do is very carefully take the 1, pull it outside 5. And there you have it. Now there's probably a lot of things running through your head right now. You're probably assuming, well, those are fake dollar bills. They're not, they're real. You could be assuming that I'm just magic. You could be assuming that it's a stupid trick. There's a lot of things that run through your mind, and there's a lot of assumptions that we even deal with on a daily basis. Humans make hundreds of thousands of assumptions every day. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. That's what I want to challenge, is this issue, this topic of assumptions. And so looking at the Bible, Genesis 15:5, we read a really interesting passage on the story of Abraham. Starting in verse 4, actually, it says, "Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son, who is your own flesh and blood, will be your heir." And Abraham at this point is 100 years old. His wife is just as old. They haven't had kids yet, and so he's pretty skeptical at this point in his life. Verse 5, "He took him outside and said, 'Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.'" And now, I don't know about you, but when I read the Bible, I tend to kind of speed read past the really hard things, the things that I don't understand, a lot of Romans, stuff like that. I speed read through, and I don't really pay a lot of attention to it. But the easy stuff that I feel like I have down, I spend a lot of time on that. I meditate on it. I pray about it. And that's the stuff that I focus on. Love one another. Honor your father and mother. I'm like, yes, read that over and over again. I journal about it. That's the stuff that I tend to focus on. It's so interesting in this story because what God did is just as powerful as what God said. God took Abraham outside. You see, before God took Abraham outside, he's sitting in his tent. I don't know what he's thinking about. And here God comes to him and he says, "Abraham, I'm going to give you a son." And there in his tent, he starts assuming. He starts assuming that he's too old. He starts assuming that his time has come and gone. He's sitting there in his tent and he's got an 8-foot ceiling above him. He's got an 8-foot ceiling on what God can do because of those assumptions. And so God brings Abraham outside into the stars, to the sky, and he says, "Count them, if you even can." And God brings him outside, and it's so symbolic because outside there's infinite room. God can do anything. He brings him out of this 8-foot ceiling that Abraham had God in originally. But that doesn't matter. What does matter is that Abraham will never look at the sky the same again. Abraham will never be able to look at the stars the same again because they symbolize God's promise to Abraham. And even earlier on, when the Lord called Abraham out of his hometown, he said, "To this land I will show you." So vague, so ambiguous. He doesn't even specify anything, and yet Abraham goes. And so I just want to talk about the dangers of assumptions and how we can get so caught up in assuming things that it can even hurt our long-term effectiveness with God. And so I think too often we sit in our tent, we sit in our room, we sit in our gated communities, and we assume. And we get comfortable with life, and we assume that maybe we're too young to do anything. Maybe we assume that we're too old to do anything. We assume that we're not educated enough. We assume. But when we do that, we put an 8-foot ceiling on what God can do. We need to let him pull us out of our tents, pull us out of our homes under the stars, where God can do anything. Stop assuming. Stop assuming that it's not meant for you. Stop assuming that you're not qualified. Because when we assume, we put a limit on God, on what God can do with us and in us. And so the question is, what 8-foot ceilings have you placed on God? What promises have you given up on? What assumptions are keeping you from doing what God wants you to do? You see, at this stage in Abraham's life, he's super old, his wife is super old, and they're like, we have no shot at having a kid. In fact, Rebecca even laughed when God said they would have a son. 25 years later, after God had promised them a child, Isaac is born. And I just wonder if God waited 25 years till it got to the point where they're like, well, it's not going to happen. If he waited 25 years after Abraham was 100, super old at this point, if he waited until it got to the impossible and he broke through that 8-foot ceiling 25 years later to say, hey, nothing is impossible for me. Because it seems to me the people that God uses the most are the people that assume the least. Joshua didn't assume that the sun couldn't stand still. Peter didn't assume that he couldn't walk on water. Mary didn't assume that she couldn't have a kid, even though she was a virgin. Faith isn't mindless ignorance. It's simply refusing to limit God to logical constraints. And I think Judah Smith said it so great about grace, and I think it applies to faith. And that is that sometimes our minds are our own worst enemies because faith isn't logical. Stop assuming that it will be. Don't put an 8-foot ceiling on God. To go somewhere you've never gone before, you've got to do something you've never done before.